What if everything you thought you knew about warfare, about survival, about the very nature of reading the land was completely wrong? What if there existed men who could feel the breath of the earth itself, who could trace invisible rivers of air that flowed beneath your feet, currents that no instrument could measure and no Western science could explain? What if I told you that in 1943, in the scorched deserts of the Pacific Theater, a single Navajo scout, armed with nothing but a hand-drawn map that looked like the scribbles of a madman, managed to lead 7 American soldiers through an impossible gauntlet of 300 Japanese soldiers, and not a single enemy ever heard them, saw them, or even sensed their presence? Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching this from. What city, what state, what country? And if this channel has ever shown you something that changed the way you see history, something they never taught you in school, then please hit that subscribe button. We are fighting to bring you these buried stories, these forgotten heroes, and we cannot do it without your help. Now, let us return to the Pacific, to the island of Bougainville, to the night that should have been impossible. The year was 1943, and the Solomon Islands campaign had become a grinding nightmare of mud, malaria, and sudden death. The Japanese Imperial Army had fortified Bougainville with a network of observation posts, hidden machine gun nests, and patrol routes so intricate that American commanders called it the spider web. Every attempt to move reconnaissance teams through the northern sector had ended in disaster. 14 American soldiers had been killed in the previous 3 weeks alone, their bodies sometimes found days later, stripped of equipment, positioned as warnings on the jungle trails. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Whitfield sat in the command tent on the night of November 17th, staring at a map that offered no solutions. The Japanese controlled the high ground. They controlled the sight lines. They controlled the only paths that did not lead directly into swampland, so treacherous that even native guides refused to enter. Whitfield had been ordered to establish an observation post on the northern ridge before the main assault could begin, but every route was suicide. It was then that Sergeant Major Daniel Coldwater entered the tent. Coldwater was Diné, a full-blooded Navajo from the reservation lands near Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. He had been assigned to the unit as a code talker, one of those men whose native language had become the only unbreakable cipher in the Pacific War. But Coldwater was more than a translator of words. He came from a long line of Hatawi, medicine men who had preserved knowledge that stretched back beyond the memory of written history. Coldwater carried with him a rolled piece of canvas, stained and worn from weeks in the jungle humidity. When he spread it across Whitfield's table, the lieutenant colonel felt his stomach tighten with frustration. The document looked like nothing he had ever seen. Curved lines intersected at impossible angles, symbols that resembled neither topographic markers nor military notation covered the surface. Small arrows pointed in directions that seemed to contradict each other, and in several places, dotted lines disappeared into what appeared to be representations of the earth itself, diving downward as if the map showed not just the surface, but something beneath. "What is this?" Whitfield demanded. He had been awake for 31 hours. He had written letters to the families of 6 dead men that week. He did not have patience for what appeared to be indigenous mysticism. Coldwater did not flinch at the colonel's tone. He had grown accustomed to the dismissal, the barely concealed contempt that Western officers showed when confronted with knowledge they could not immediately classify. He simply placed his weathered hand on the canvas and spoke in a voice that carried the patient rhythm of a man who had learned to wait. "This is a wind map, Colonel, but not the wind you know, not the wind that moves through the trees. This is the breath of the earth. The currents that flow beneath the surface, through caves and crevices, through ancient lava tubes and underground rivers. My grandfather's grandfather mapped these currents across the sacred lands. He taught that the earth breathes just as we breathe, in patterns that repeat, in rhythms that can be learned. I have spent 3 weeks mapping this island's breath. Whitfield looked at the other officers in the tent. Captain Reynolds, a career military man from Virginia, actually laughed. The sound was short and bitter, the laugh of a man who had seen too much death to find anything genuinely funny anymore. "Sergeant," Reynolds said, "we appreciate your service with the code talking program. Truly. But we are not going to stake men's lives on some kind of native folk tradition. We need real intelligence, patrol routes, guard positions, not drawings that look like they belong in an anthropology museum." Coldwater remained still. His dark eyes moved across each face in the tent, reading the skepticism, the exhaustion, the desperation that none of them would admit. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, and something in that quiet tone made even Reynolds stop smiling. 3 nights ago, I walked the northern sector alone. I passed within 40 feet of a Japanese patrol. 8 men. I could hear their breathing. I could smell the tobacco on their uniforms. They never saw me. They never heard me, because I was moving with the earth's breath, not against it. The currents that flow beneath the surface create dead zones, places where sound does not carry, where scent disperses before it can be detected. My people have used these paths for hunting since before your ancestors knew this land existed. The silence in the tent was absolute. Whitfield stared at the Navajo scout, searching for any sign of deception or delusion. But Coldwater's face showed nothing but the weathered certainty of a man stating simple facts. "That is impossible," Reynolds said, but his voice had lost its mocking edge. "The northern sector is covered. We have lost 2 full reconnaissance teams trying exactly what you are describing." "They were walking against the breath," Coldwater replied. "They were following the surface wind, which betrays every footstep, carries every whisper directly to enemy ears. The subterranean currents flow in opposite directions. Where the surface wind moves east, the underground breath moves west. Step into those channels, and you become invisible. Not through magic, through physics that your instruments have not yet learned to measure." Whitfield picked up the strange map and studied it more carefully. Now that he looked with intention, he began to see a pattern in the chaos. The curved lines did seem to follow the contours of the land, but they also dove beneath it, indicating passages through the volcanic rock that formed the island's foundation. The arrows, he realized, were not contradicting each other. They were showing movement at different depths, different layers of an invisible atmosphere that existed below the ground his men walked on. "Even if this is real," Whitfield said slowly, "how would we navigate it? My men cannot see these currents. They cannot feel them." Coldwater nodded once. "That is why I will lead them myself. 7 men, no more. We must move as one body, breathing together, stepping together. I will teach them to feel what I feel. It will take 3 days of preparation. By the 4th night, we will be on that ridge, and no Japanese soldier will ever know we passed." The proposal was insane. It violated every principle of military protocol. It placed the lives of American soldiers in the hands of a single indigenous scout, operating on knowledge that no Western science could verify. And yet, looking at that strange map, looking at the calm certainty in Coldwater's eyes, Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield felt something he had not felt in weeks. He felt hope. The 7 men were selected from volunteers who understood they might not return. Private First Class Thomas Redhawk, a Lakota from South Dakota, who had grown up hunting on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Corporal James Sullivan, an Irish-American from Boston who had somehow earned Coldwater's respect during their weeks of service together. Staff Sergeant William Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American whose family had faced discrimination that made him particularly sensitive to the dismissal Coldwater endured. Private Anthony Morales from New Mexico, whose grandmother still spoke the old Spanish of the conquistadors. Private Robert Jackson from rural Georgia, a man of few words but remarkable instincts. Private First Class Henry Williams from Louisiana, who had grown up in the bayous and understood that nature held secrets beyond ordinary perception. And finally, Sergeant Michael Torres, whose family had fought in every American war since the Revolution. For 3 days, Coldwater took them into the jungle in shifts, teaching them to feel what he called the underground breath. He would have them close their eyes and stand perfectly still for hours, focusing on the subtle changes in air pressure that indicated subterranean channels. He taught them to recognize the way certain plants grew differently where underground air currents emerged, how the moisture patterns on rock faces revealed invisible flows of air rising from volcanic caves below. He taught them breathing exercises that synchronized their respiratory rhythms so that 7 men could move as one organism, their exhalations timed to mask footsteps, their inhalations aligned with natural pauses in the jungle's symphony of sounds. Most of all, he taught them to trust what they could not see. On the night of November 20th, the 8 men gathered at the edge of the designated insertion point. The moon was a thin crescent, providing almost no light. The Japanese patrols had been tracked for 72 hours, their patterns recorded, their timing calculated. There was a window of approximately 47 minutes when the northern sector would be at its most vulnerable, when the changing of guards created gaps in coverage that a skilled team might exploit. But Coldwater shook his head when Whitfield presented this information. "The patrol patterns do not matter," he said. "We will not be moving through their gaps. We will be moving beneath their perception. The underground breath flows strongest at 3:17 in the morning. That is when we go." 3:17 was in the middle of the heaviest patrol activity. On paper it was suicide, but Whitfield had run out of paper solutions. He gave the order. The insertion began at the mouth of a dry stream bed that the military maps showed as impassable. Coldwater led the team into the darkness, moving with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural. He would pause at seemingly random intervals, his hand raised in the signal for absolute stillness, and the men would freeze in place, their breath held, their hearts pounding so loudly they were certain the enemy must hear. But no enemy came. No shots rang out. No challenges were shouted into the darkness. Private Sullivan would later describe the experience in his personal journal, a document that remained classified for over 50 years before being released to military historians. "It was like walking underwater," Sullivan wrote, "like being in a dream where the normal rules did not apply. Coldwater would gesture for us to move, and we would step exactly where he stepped, and the jungle that had seemed so full of noise would go quiet around us. I do not mean it got softer. I mean it went silent, completely silent, as if we had stepped through some invisible curtain into a place where sound could not exist. I felt pressure in my ears, the way you feel when you dive too deep in a lake. My skin tingled. And though I could see Japanese soldiers moving on the ridge above us, though I could see the glow of their cigarettes not 60 yards away, they never once looked in our direction. It was as if we had become ghosts. Coldwater led them through lava tubes that did not appear on any map, passages so narrow that the men had to turn sideways to squeeze through. In these moments, the underground breath became impossible to ignore. Currents of cool air flowed past their faces, carrying strange scents of mineral and earth, and something older, something that smelled like time itself. The volcanic rock was porous, riddled with channels that created a labyrinth beneath the surface jungle, and through these channels, invisible rivers of air flowed according to patterns that only cold water could read. At one point, the team emerged from a tunnel directly beneath a Japanese observation post. They could hear voices above them, conversations in a language none of them understood, the scrape of boots on stone, the metallic click of weapons being checked. Coldwater signaled for the men to lie flat against the earth, to press their faces into the soil, to breathe in perfect unison with a rhythm he tapped against the ground. For 17 minutes, they lay motionless while Japanese soldiers stood literally on top of them, separated by perhaps 8 feet of volcanic rock. Private Morales would later say that he made his peace with God in those minutes, certain that his life was measured in seconds. But the soldiers above never looked down, never investigated the strange sensation that should have told them enemies were near. The underground breath, flowing upward through cracks in the rock, carried their scent away, dispersed their sound, created a bubble of sensory invisibility that defied all logic. When they emerged on the northern ridge 3 hours later, not a single shot had been fired, not a single alarm had been raised. 7 American soldiers and 1 Navajo scout had walked through a net of 300 enemy soldiers without disturbing a single strand of the web. Sergeant Torres set up the observation post, while the others established a defensive perimeter. From their position, they could see the Japanese encampments spread across the valley below, could count artillery pieces and ammunition depots, could identify command structures and communication lines. The intelligence they gathered in the following 36 hours would prove instrumental in the assault that followed, an assault that succeeded where 3 previous attempts had failed, saving countless American lives. But it was not the tactical value of the mission that haunted the men who survived it. It was the impossibility of what they had experienced. They had walked through the Earth's breath. They had become invisible, not through technology or camouflage, but through alignment with forces that their Western education told them could not exist. And none of them would ever be able to fully explain what had happened, because the words for it did not exist in English. Coldwater refused all recognition for the mission. When Whitfield attempted to recommend him for the Silver Star, the Navajo scout simply shook his head. "The breath of the earth does not belong to me," he said. "I cannot accept praise for sharing what was given to me by my ancestors. They walked these invisible paths for thousands of years before Europeans knew this ocean existed. I am only a messenger." But the story did not end on that ridge in Bougainville. The military, in its ponderous and bureaucratic way, had taken notice. Men who should have died had survived. An impossible mission had succeeded through means that no field manual could explain. And in the shadowed offices of military intelligence, questions were being asked that would lead to investigations spanning decades. Within 6 months of the Bougainville mission, a classified research program was initiated under a code name that remains redacted to this day. Scientists were brought in from universities across the country, physicists and geologists and anthropologists who were given fragments of Coldwater's wind map and asked to explain what they saw. Most declared it nonsense, indigenous superstition with no basis in physical reality. But a small number, a very small number, looked at those strange curved lines and saw something else. They saw a phenomenon that Western science had never bothered to measure because Western science had assumed it could not exist. Underground air currents, it turned out, were very real. Volcanic islands like Bougainville were riddled with passages and caves that created complex systems of airflow, driven by temperature differentials, by the heating and cooling of rock, by the subtle rhythms of geothermal activity deep below the surface. These currents could affect local atmospheric conditions in ways that were measurable but had never been systematically studied. They could create acoustic shadows, zones where sound waves were disrupted and scattered. They could disperse scent molecules in unpredictable patterns. They could, in theory, create exactly the kind of sensory dead zones that Coldwater had described. But how had the Navajo known? How had they mapped these invisible rivers centuries before Western science even acknowledged their existence? The answer, when researchers finally found it, was both simple and profound. They had paid attention. For thousands of years, while European cultures were building cities and fighting wars and developing technologies that allowed them to ignore the natural world, the Diné had been listening to the earth. They had watched how animals moved, noted where certain plants grew, tracked the patterns of moisture and temperature that indicated underground flows. They had developed a science of observation, so patient and so detailed that it could detect phenomena that Western instruments had never been designed to measure. Coldwater's grandfather's grandfather had not been a mystic. He had been a scientist working in a tradition that predated European contact by millennia. His wind maps were not superstition. They were data, accumulated across generations, refined through careful observation, passed down through oral traditions that encoded information with remarkable precision. The classified research program ran for 17 years before being quietly terminated. Its findings were buried in archives that few researchers have ever accessed. But the questions it raised never fully disappeared. If the Navajo had mapped invisible air currents, what else had they understood that Western science had yet to discover? What other knowledge had been dismissed as primitive superstition simply because it did not fit within European frameworks of understanding? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what had been lost? Daniel Coldwater returned to his reservation after the war. He never spoke publicly about the Bougainville mission or the strange wind map that had made it possible. He lived quietly, teaching the old ways to younger generations who seemed increasingly disconnected from the knowledge of their ancestors. He died in 1978, and his personal papers were inherited by his daughter, who donated them to the Navajo Nation Museum 2 decades later. Among those papers was a letter Coldwater had written but never sent, addressed to Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield. The letter was dated March of 1967, more than 20 years after the war had ended. "Colonel," the letter began, "I have heard that your government has been studying the wind maps. I have heard that scientists have been trying to understand what I showed you that night in Bougainville. I want you to know that they will never fully succeed, not because the knowledge is secret or magical, but because it cannot be separated from the land that produced it. My ancestors did not create those maps through instruments or experiments. They created them through relationship, through generations of living in dialogue with the earth, through love for the places that sustained them. You cannot extract the information and leave behind the connection. The two are inseparable. This is what your science does not understand, and perhaps cannot understand. It tries to take knowledge without taking responsibility. It tries to learn without loving. And so it will always see only fragments, only pieces of a greater whole that can only be perceived through a different way of being." The letter was never sent. Perhaps Coldwater decided it would not be understood. Perhaps he simply realized that some truths cannot be transmitted through words alone. But the questions he raised continue to echo through the decades. In an age of satellites and drones and technology that can map every square inch of the planet's surface, what remains invisible? What currents still flow beneath our perception, waiting to be discovered by those patient enough to listen? And what knowledge are we losing every day as indigenous traditions fade, as elders die without passing on what they knew? As the world becomes increasingly convinced that the only valid truth is the truth that machines can measure. The night of November 20th, 1943. 8 men walked through the impossible. 7 of them survived the war and carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. None of them could ever fully explain what happened, but all of them knew, with a certainty that defied rational explanation, that there was more to the world than Western science had taught them to believe. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispers across the desert, across the sacred lands of the Diné, there are those who claim they can still feel it, the underground breath, the invisible rivers, the ancient currents that have flowed since long before humans walked this earth, and that will continue to flow long after we are gone. The question is whether we will remember how to listen before it is too late. The story should have ended there, in the quiet dignity of a Navajo elder's passing, in the dusty archives of a museum where few visitors ever ventured. But the earth keeps its own records, and the breath that flows beneath the surface carries secrets that refuse to stay buried. In 1983, 5 years after Daniel Coldwater's death, a young geologist named Dr. Sarah Whitehorse was conducting research in the lava fields of New Mexico when she stumbled upon something that would consume the next 4 decades of her life. Whitehorse was herself of mixed heritage, her mother's family tracing back to the Jicarilla Apache, her father's to Swedish immigrants who had settled in Minnesota 3 generations earlier. She had been raised in the scientific tradition, earning her doctorate from Stanford, publishing papers in respected journals, building a career that seemed destined for academic success. But on that autumn afternoon in New Mexico, crawling through a collapsed lava tube near the Zuni Mountains, Dr. Whitehorse felt something that no instrument in her pack could measure. A current of air, impossibly cold, flowing upward from a fissure so narrow she could barely fit her hand inside. The current pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost organic, strengthening and weakening in patterns that matched no known geological process. And when she pressed her ear to the stone, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Voices, faint, impossibly distant, but unmistakably human, speaking in a language she did not recognize, in tones that rose and fell like ancient songs. Dr. Whitehorse was a scientist. She knew that auditory hallucinations could be triggered by stress, by dehydration, by the subtle effects of confined spaces on the human mind. She documented the experience in her field notes with clinical detachment, attributing it to fatigue and the disorienting effects of underground exploration. But that night, lying in her tent beneath a sky blazing with stars, she could not shake the feeling that she had touched something that defied her training to explain. Over the following months, she began to research the phenomenon. She discovered scattered references in geological literature to unexplained acoustic phenomena in volcanic regions, to sounds that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth, to currents of air that moved in patterns that contradicted surface weather conditions. Most scientists dismissed these reports as measurement errors or misinterpretations, but a small number had taken them seriously, and their work had been systematically suppressed. In a footnote buried in a 1957 paper on geothermal dynamics, Dr. Whitehorse found a reference to something called Project Subsurface Breath. The paper's author, a physicist named Dr. Harold Jennings, who had worked for a defense contractor during the Cold War, mentioned the project only in passing, noting that his research had been informed by classified studies conducted in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He offered no further details, and all attempts to locate additional documentation led to dead ends. But the name was enough: subsurface breath, the same phrase that Daniel Coldwater had used to describe his wind maps, the same concept that Western science had supposedly dismissed as indigenous superstition. Dr. Whitehorse became obsessed. She used every connection she had, called in every favor, navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of military archives and classified document repositories. For 3 years, she found nothing. And then, in 1986, a manila envelope appeared in her university mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed a room that looked like a laboratory, filled with equipment that Dr. Whitehorse could not identify. Banks of instruments lined the walls, connected by cables that snaked across the floor like mechanical serpents. In the center of the room stood a large table, and on that table lay what appeared to be a reproduction of Coldwater's wind map, enlarged to perhaps 10 feet across, covered with annotations in multiple hands. But it was the figures in the photograph that made Dr. Whitehorse's hands tremble. Standing around the table were 7 men in military uniforms, their faces clearly visible despite the photograph's age. And standing apart from them, his expression unreadable, was a young man in civilian clothes, whose features were unmistakably Navajo. The handwritten note contained only 3 sentences. They tried to weaponize it. They failed. Some things refused to be controlled. There was no signature, Dr. Whitehorse would spend the next 2 decades trying to identify the men in that photograph, trying to locate the laboratory, trying to understand what had been attempted and why it had failed. She traveled to archives in Washington, to military installations that officially did not exist, to remote locations where aging veterans lived out their final years with secrets they had sworn never to reveal. Most doors remained closed, most questions went unanswered. But piece by piece, fragment by fragment, a picture began to emerge. Project Subsurface Breath had been initiated in 1944, shortly after the success of the Bougainville mission. Military intelligence had recognized the potential applications of Cold Water's wind maps, not just for infiltration, but for a wide range of purposes that remained classified even decades later. If underground air currents could mask the movement of soldiers, what else could they conceal? What signals could they disrupt? What communications could they interfere with? The project had recruited indigenous consultants from multiple nations, not just Navajo, but also Hopi, Zuni, Apache, and several tribes whose participation was never officially documented. These men and women had been brought to a facility in the Nevada desert, a facility that did not appear on any map, and asked to share their knowledge of the Earth's hidden breath. Most had refused. They understood that some knowledge was sacred, that some powers were not meant to be harnessed for purposes of destruction. They had seen what European civilization had done with the technologies it had developed, the cities flattened by bombs, the landscapes scarred by war, and they had no desire to contribute to that legacy. But a few had cooperated, whether through coercion, through financial pressure, through genuine belief that their knowledge could be used for good. A handful of indigenous practitioners had worked with the military scientists, had shared fragments of the oral traditions that had been passed down through countless generations. The results had been catastrophic. In 1947, according to documents that Dr. Whitehorse was never able to fully authenticate, an experiment had been conducted in the underground chambers of the Nevada facility. The goal had been to amplify the subterranean currents, to use specially designed equipment to strengthen the flows that naturally occurred beneath the Earth's surface. The scientists believed that if they could control these currents, they could create zones of acoustic and electromagnetic invisibility on demand, could shield military installations from detection, could render entire armies invisible to enemy surveillance. But the Earth, it seemed, did not appreciate being manipulated. The first sign of trouble came as a low vibration, a frequency so deep that it was felt rather than heard. The walls of the underground chamber began to resonate, and the instruments designed to measure the subterranean currents suddenly registered readings that were off every scale. The indigenous consultants who were present recognized immediately what was happening. They had been taught since childhood to respect the boundaries of the Earth's power, to take only what was freely given, to never attempt to force the natural flows into unnatural patterns. Their ancestors had warned of consequences for those who tried to dominate rather than cooperate with the living world. They tried to stop the experiment. They begged the scientists to shut down the equipment, to release the pressures that were building beneath the facility. But the military personnel in charge had invested too much in the project, had staked their careers on its success, had convinced themselves that indigenous warnings were merely superstition dressed in the language of caution. What happened next was never officially recorded. The facility's records for the period between November 15th and November 28th, 1947, are completely blank. Personnel files show that 11 researchers were transferred to other projects immediately afterward, but none of them ever spoke publicly about what had occurred. 3 of the indigenous consultants simply disappeared, their names vanishing from all documentation, their families never informed of their fate. But the land remembered. In the decades that followed, the area surrounding the Nevada facility became the site of increasingly strange phenomena. Ranchers reported livestock behaving erratically, running in circles, refusing to graze in certain areas. Pilots flying over the region reported instrument malfunctions, compasses spinning wildly, altimeters giving readings that bore no relationship to actual altitude. In 1962, a geological survey team documented a series of underground chambers that should not have existed according to any known geological process. Caverns that seemed to have been carved by forces that left no recognizable traces. And there were the sounds. Dozens of witnesses over the years reported hearing voices emanating from the earth itself, voices speaking in languages that no one could identify, voices that seemed to be warning, pleading, crying out for something that could no longer be named. The scientific establishment dismissed these reports as mass hysteria, as the product of Cold War paranoia and desert isolation. But Dr. Whitehorse had heard those voices herself in the lava tubes of New Mexico, and she knew that something had been awakened that was never meant to be disturbed. In 1994, Dr. Whitehorse received a visit that would change the course of her investigation. A woman appeared at her office at the University of Arizona, a woman in her 70s whose face bore the weathered dignity of someone who had seen much and said little. She introduced herself as Margaret Coldwater, Daniel's daughter, the same woman who had donated her father's papers to the Navajo Nation Museum. Margaret had heard of Dr. Whitehorse's research. She had followed the geologist's career with quiet attention, waiting for the right moment to share what she knew. And now, she said, the time had come. My father never told the full story of Bougainville, Margaret began. What he shared with the military was only a fragment, the smallest piece of a much larger picture. He knew that they would try to use it for purposes that violated the sacred trust. So he gave them enough to save lives, but not enough to cause the harm he foresaw. Margaret reached into her bag and withdrew a bundle wrapped in cloth that had been woven in patterns. Dr. Whitehorse recognized as traditional Navajo. When she unwrapped it, the geologist saw a collection of materials that took her breath away. Photographs she had never seen, documents written in Coldwater's hand, and most remarkable of all, a complete wind map, far more detailed than anything that had survived in the official archives, showing not just Bougainville, but the entire Pacific region, with lines and symbols that extended deep into the earth, mapping currents that flowed beneath oceans, beneath mountain ranges, beneath the foundations of continents themselves. My father believed that the earth is alive, Margaret said. Not in the metaphorical sense that Western poets sometimes use, literally alive. A conscious being with its own purposes, its own intelligence, its own way of communicating with those who know how to listen. The breath that flows beneath the surface is not just air, it is thought, it is memory. It is the Earth's way of speaking to itself, of maintaining its awareness across distances too vast for human understanding. Dr. Whitehorse stared at the map, her scientific training warring with her instincts. She wanted to dismiss what Margaret was saying as the romantic projections of an aging woman, as the natural human tendency to find meaning in random patterns. But she had felt those currents herself. She had heard those voices. And she could not deny that something was present in the Earth's hidden spaces, something that defied every category her education had provided. Margaret continued, the experiment in Nevada did not fail because the technology was inadequate. It failed because the Earth refused. It pushed back. The currents that the scientists tried to control reversed direction, flowed backward through their instruments, destroyed their equipment and scattered their researchers. Some of those researchers never recovered. They spent the rest of their lives in institutions, speaking of things that no one believed, of voices that would not stop, of a presence that had marked them for intrusion into spaces where they did not belong. What happened to the indigenous consultants? Dr. Whitehorse asked. The ones who disappeared. Margaret's expression grew very still. My father asked that question for 30 years. He used every connection he had, contacted every government agency, searched every archive that would grant him access. He never found definitive answers, but he had a theory. She paused, and in that silence, Dr. Whitehorse felt the weight of something ancient pressing against the boundaries of the modern world. He believed that the earth took them back, not killed them, took them, into the currents, into the breath. They became part of what they had helped to violate. They are still there, still moving through the underground rivers of air, still crying out to anyone who knows how to listen. The voices that people hear in that region are not ghosts in the traditional sense. They are the consultants who were absorbed into the phenomenon they tried to control. The room seemed to grow darker, though the sun still shone brightly through the windows. "My father heard them once," Margaret said, "near the end of his life. He traveled to Nevada, to the edge of the restricted zone, and he spent 3 days in the desert listening. On the third night, he heard them clearly. They were speaking in their own languages, Hopi and Zuni and Apache, and they were warning him. They were telling him that the government had not given up, that somewhere, in facilities even more hidden than the one in Nevada, the work continued, that new generations of researchers were trying to solve the problem that had defeated their predecessors, and that this time the consequences might be far worse." Dr. Whitehorse felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Are you saying that Project Subsurface Breath is still active?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "Not under that name, not in any form that could be recognized. But my father believed that the essential project never ended. The military recognized the potential too clearly, the ability to move invisibly, to shield installations from detection, to interfere with enemy communications through natural phenomena that could never be traced. These capabilities are too valuable to abandon simply because the first attempts failed. Somewhere, someone is still trying, and they have had 70 years to learn from the mistakes of the past." The two women talked until long after dark. Margaret shared everything she knew, every document her father had preserved, every theory he had developed over his decades of quiet investigation. When she finally left, she pressed Dr. Whitehorse's hands between her own and looked into her eyes with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "My father believed that some knowledge must be protected, even from those who claim to protect us. He believed that the earth has boundaries that should not be crossed, powers that should not be harnessed, voices that should not be silenced. He spent his life trying to honor that belief, even when it meant lying to the people who thought they were his allies. I'm telling you this because you have heard the voices too. You know they are real. And you may be the only one who can ensure that his sacrifice was not in vain." Margaret Coldwater died in her sleep 3 weeks later. The official cause was heart failure, but Dr. Whitehorse could not shake the feeling that the timing was not coincidental. She had seen enough by then to question the official explanation of everything. For the next 15 years, Dr. Whitehorse continued her research in secret. She had learned from Daniel Coldwater's example that visibility attracted interference, that the best way to preserve dangerous knowledge was to appear to have abandoned it. Publicly, she returned to conventional geological research, publishing papers that attracted modest attention, building a reputation for solid, if unremarkable, work. Privately, she accumulated a collection of evidence that grew more disturbing with each passing year. She documented the cases of 19 individuals who had reported hearing underground voices in the American Southwest, interviewing each one extensively, noting the remarkable consistency of their accounts. She located 3 surviving members of the original Project Subsurface Breath team, each now in their 90s, each suffering from conditions that conventional medicine could not explain. She discovered references in recently declassified documents to at least 4 successor programs, each operating under different names, each apparently terminated after encountering problems that the files described only in the vaguest terms. And she found evidence that Margaret Coldwater's warning had been accurate. Somewhere the work was continuing. In 2008, Dr. Whitehorse obtained a fragment of a document that appeared to have been written sometime in the 1990s. The document referenced a program called Deep Echo, described as an advanced research initiative into subsurface acoustic phenomena. It mentioned consultation with indigenous knowledge holders, the development of new sensor technologies, and promising results in what it called harmonic resonance mapping. Most significantly, it included a budget line of $47 million, a figure that suggested a level of official support far beyond anything Dr. Whitehorse had imagined. The document was incomplete, torn from a larger report, and its authenticity could not be verified. But one phrase near the end stopped Dr. Whitehorse's breath when she read it. Initial contacts with non-human intelligence appear stable, communication protocols under development. Non-human intelligence. The Earth itself. The living presence that Daniel Coldwater's ancestors had recognized for millennia. That Western science had dismissed as primitive superstition, that a hidden corner of the military-industrial complex had apparently been trying to exploit for over 70 years. And if Deep Echo had achieved stable contact, what were they communicating? What were they learning? And what, in return, were they offering? Dr. Whitehorse is still alive as of this recording. She is in her 70s now, living quietly in a small town in northern Arizona, continuing her research with a determination that age has not diminished. She has never published her findings on Project Subsurface Breath or its successors, believing that public exposure would only drive the programs deeper underground, would only make them more difficult to monitor and understand. But she has shared her work with a small network of researchers, indigenous elders, and concerned citizens who believe that some secrets are too important to be left entirely in the hands of those who would misuse them. This network operates without official recognition, without funding, without any of the resources that their adversaries command. They are watchers, documenters, preservers of knowledge that they hope will one day be shared with a world ready to receive it, and they continue to listen. In 2019, a member of this network reported an increase in unusual activity near the site of the original Nevada facility. Military vehicles were seen on roads that had been abandoned for decades. Construction equipment was photographed being transported into the restricted zone, and several witnesses reported hearing sounds from beneath the earth that had never been recorded before, sounds that seemed almost like language, like attempts at communication, like a voice that was finally learning to speak in terms that human ears could understand. What did those sounds mean? What was being built in the Nevada desert, behind fences topped with razor wire and signs warning of lethal force? What had 70 years of secret research accomplished, and what new phase was now beginning? These questions remain unanswered. The watchers continue to observe, the earth continues to breathe, and somewhere beneath our feet, in channels and caverns and passages that no map has ever charted, currents of invisible air carry messages that most of humanity will never hear. The knowledge that the Navajo preserved for countless generations, the understanding that Daniel Coldwater tried to protect even as he shared fragments with his military allies, the truth that Margaret Coldwater passed on with her dying strength. These things persist in the hidden spaces, waiting for those who are willing to listen. The story of the wind map did not end on a ridge in Bougainville in 1943. It did not end in the catastrophe of the Nevada facility. It did not end with Daniel Coldwater's quiet death or his daughter's final testimony. It continues even now in laboratories we are not meant to know about, in programs whose existence is officially denied, in a conversation between human ambition and ancient power, whose outcome remains uncertain. What we do know is this: the Earth is patient. It has existed for billions of years before us, and will exist for billions of years after. The currents that flow beneath its surface have been flowing since the continents first took their present form, carrying information and energy, and something that can only be called awareness, through networks too vast for human comprehension. Those who have tried to control these currents have paid prices that we are only beginning to understand. Those who have tried to exploit them for purposes of war have found that the earth does not distinguish between nations or ideologies. And those who have listened with respect, with humility, with the patience that indigenous traditions teach, have learned things that Western science is still struggling to articulate. Daniel Coldwater knew this. He walked through the impossible because he had learned to walk with the earth rather than against it. He carried a map that looked like madness to those who could only see the surface. But that revealed depths of understanding that our civilization has barely begun to approach. Perhaps one day we will learn what he knew. Perhaps the children of future generations will be taught to feel the underground breath, to read the currents that flow beneath their feet, to understand that the ground they walk on is not dead matter, but living presence. Perhaps the knowledge that indigenous peoples have preserved against all odds will finally be recognized not as primitive superstition, but as advanced science, a science of relationship rather than domination, of listening rather than controlling. Or perhaps we will continue on our present course, exploiting what we do not understand, awakening powers that we cannot control, until the earth decides that our experiments have gone far enough. The voices are still speaking, in the lava tubes of New Mexico, in the desert air of Nevada, in the sacred places where the old ones gathered to commune with forces that have no names in English. They are speaking to anyone who will listen, warning of consequences, pleading for understanding, crying out with the grief of those who have been absorbed into currents from which there is no return. If you are watching this, if something in this story has resonated with a truth you have always suspected but never been able to name, then perhaps you are one of those who can hear. Perhaps the breath of the earth is even now moving through you, awakening senses that your education taught you to ignore, reconnecting you with knowledge that your ancestors knew, but that modern life has trained you to forget. The Navajo have a saying, "The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth." Daniel Coldwater understood this. He lived it. And in the end, he died trying to protect it, to ensure that the powers he had touched would not be turned into instruments of destruction. His wind map still exists, somewhere in the archives that guard the secrets of programs that officially never happened. But the knowledge it represented cannot be contained in any document. It lives in the land itself, in the currents that will flow long after every government has fallen and every military has disbanded, in the breath that the earth has been breathing since the fires of creation first cooled into stone. Listen, the earth is speaking. And if you want to understand, if you want to find peace in a world that seems increasingly chaotic and threatening, remember that there is a power greater than any government, a wisdom older than any science, a love deeper than any human institution can offer. God created this world with purposes we are only beginning to understand. Jesus Christ walked this earth to teach us that true power comes not through domination, but through surrender, not through control, but through faith, not through understanding everything, but through trusting the one who understands all. The breath of the earth is, in the end, the breath of its creator, moving through hidden channels, speaking in voices that transcend all human language, calling us back to a relationship that we have forgotten, but can never fully lose. Seek that relationship. Listen for that voice. Trust in something greater than the powers of this world, greater than the secrets of hidden laboratories, greater than the ambitions of those who would control what was meant to be free. The wind map was never about military strategy. It was about connection, about humility, about walking in harmony with forces that we did not create and cannot destroy. Daniel Coldwater understood this. And now, perhaps so do you. The earth is still breathing, the currents are still flowing, the voices are still speaking. Are you listening?